I am 88 years old, and I have spent most of my life pretending that nothing unusual ever happened in the winter of 1979. The people of Everidge Valley still go about their business as if the forest around us is nothing more than timber, elk, and cold wind. I learned long ago that silence keeps a man safe, but tonight, my bones ache with memory, and the truth presses against my heart like a slow, steady weight. I speak because the firelight feels like company, because I can smell wet cedar drifting through cracked window, and because the secret I've carried for decades refuses to stay buried any longer. Back then, I was 22, restless, and trying to survive far from the noise of the world. I worked for whoever needed me, stacking lumber, trapping beaver, guiding hunters, and delivering supplies to cabins deeper in the woods. The valley was a lonely place, especially in the fall when the first frost turned the creek into a silver ribbon and the sun disappeared long before supper. At night, I often sat by my lantern, listening to the creek's distant murmur, letting the soft glow paint shadows across timber walls. My hands smelled like wood smoke and pine sap, and even then, the forest felt like the only thing in this world that truly knew me. One afternoon near the end of October, I headed out to gather firewood before another storm rolled across the ridges. The sky carried a heavy bruise, and the wind already smelled like snow. My breath floated in front of me in pale clouds, and every footstep left a dark print on soaked leaves. I followed a familiar path, swinging my axe over my shoulder, humming quietly to keep myself company. When the wind paused, I heard something faint, like a small cry carried through the trees. At first, I thought it was a fox, but the sound had a sharper edge, soft, frightened, undeniably human. My heartbeat quickened. The nearest cabin stood miles away, and no child would wander alone into these woods. I left my tools beside a fallen spruce and moved toward the sound, pushing through ferns slick with rain. The ground felt spongy beneath me, and the smell of wet bark and cold soil made my lungs sting. Again, the cry came, clearer this time, trembling, urgent. Every instinct told me I should run for help, but the forest swallowed distance, and a child could freeze before I returned. I kept going, brushing aside branches that dripped icy water down my neck. At the bottom of a shallow ravine, beneath twisted cedar roots shaped like a cradle, I found a newborn swaddled in thin cloth. Its tiny face was red with cold, and its cries tore through me with a helpless desperation I had never known. I knelt without thinking, reaching to lift the baby, but something in the silence shifted. The hairs on my arms rose. I could feel eyes on my back, steady, unblinking, ancient. I stayed perfectly still, my hand hovering above the child's cheek. The forest felt suddenly alive, every needle whispering, every crow silent. From between two black firs, a massive figure stepped into the open. The creature was easily 8 feet tall, with thick fur matted by rain, its shoulders broad enough to block the fading light. Its eyes were dark, deep, and startlingly focused. For a breath, I forgot how to move, how to think, how to breathe. Yet the creature did not roar or threaten. Its posture held no anger, only caution and a palpable fear that seemed tied to the baby lying between us. Slowly, the creature approached, each step deliberate, every muscle heavy with intent. I recognized its stance the way a man recognizes a protective parent. It knelt beside the cedar cradle and gathered the baby into its enormous arms with a gentleness that felt impossible for something so powerful. The child quieted instantly, burrowing against its thick fur, finding warmth the way any child would against a loving mother. The creature rocked slightly, humming in a low, resonant vibration. The truth struck me with the force of a revelation. The baby was not abandoned. This creature had cared for it, sheltered it, and risked exposure to save it from the cold. It was protecting the child the same way any mother would when the world threatened her. I felt shame for assuming it was a monster, shame for raising my trembling hands like a cornered animal when all it asked for was safety. The creature tilted its head, studying me, waiting for the slightest sign of hostility. I lowered my gaze, backed away slowly, and whispered that I meant no harm. The mother blinked in a way that felt almost human. She shielded the baby with her arms, lifting her gaze toward the tree line as if she sensed hunters or storm clouds gathering on distant ridges. Mist thickened like a veil between us. I remembered stories whispered in logging camps, stories dismissed with laughter or bourbon, but suddenly they no longer felt like fantasies. They felt like chapters of a living history we had refused to see. I knew I should return to town or alert the sheriff, but the impulse felt wrong. The child was safe, warm, and deeply loved. Taking him away would not save him. It would condemn him to a world built on fear and ownership, a world that treats difference as something to cage or dissect. I sensed that the creature already understood that danger better than any man could. She held her child tighter and retreated into dark, disappearing without sound, leaving only footprints in mud and a silence that felt like a vow. If I had known how much that moment would change the rhythm of my life, I might have looked away. I might have turned back before the forest tied me to a secret I would carry until my final breath, forever together. I returned to the forest the following week, carrying a small bundle of cooked potatoes, dried venison, and a wool cloth. I did not know whether the Bigfoot mother would accept any offering, but something in me felt obligated to try. The ravine looked different in early November, softened by frost and pale morning light. I laid the food near the cedar roots, careful not to disturb the cradle she had woven. I stayed long enough to hear the wind shifting through pine needles and the quiet gurgle of the hidden creek, then walked away without looking over my shoulder. I did not expect gratitude, only the comfort of knowing that if she needed to feed herself or the child, something close would be waiting. The next day, the bundle was gone. In its place, she left a thin mat woven from grasses, moss, and strands of fur. It smelled faintly of the forest floor, earthy, damp, alive. The gesture stunned me more than any roar or sudden movement ever could. She had understood my intention and responded without hostility. My chest tightened with a hesitant pride, the kind a man feels when recognized by a mysterious intelligence he once feared. For the first time in months, I sensed companionship rather than isolation. Every small detail felt meaningful. The way it mat, the way evening fog settled over creek, the distant tapping of rain against branches. The woods had become a place where silent communication felt deeper than language. Throughout that winter, I continued leaving offerings every few days. Apples in a leather sack, boiled water sealed in a tin, a scrap of flannel for warmth. She always returned something. River stones polished smooth, strips of hide that repelled rain, knots of pine resin that healed cuts. Our exchange became ritualistic, guided by trust rather than obligation. I never glimpsed her up close during that period, but I sensed her presence constantly. The forest itself felt aware, as if the pines carried her breath and the ravens carried her caution. Each time I found fresh tracks beside mine, I felt strangely protected, as though nothing in those woods judged me for my curiosity. The baby's cries changed over time. At first, they were sharp and newborn, trembling and uncertain. By late winter, the sounds grew stronger, filled with the rhythm of a life nurtured well. The Bigfoot mother had built a more secure shelter inside a hollow cedar stump, lined with ferns, bark, and fur. On several mornings, I heard the child giggling, small, warm, miraculous, and felt my heart loosen in a way I had never expected. Loneliness no longer gnawed at me with its old cruelty. Somewhere in those woods, a child was growing, cared for by a being the world refused to acknowledge as gentle. Life in town remained colder than the wind. People whispered about livestock gone missing, though I suspected coyotes more than anything mythic. Hunters returned from the hills muttering about unsettling footprints in frozen mud. Some claimed they heard wailing near the riverbank, assuming it belonged to a desperate woman or a wounded cougar. They dismissed every explanation that threatened their certainty, choosing fear over wonder. The sheriff drank coffee from a chipped mug and said nothing official, though his frown deepened each time the rumors resurfaced. A small town protects its comfort more fiercely than it protects its truth. I learned to stay quiet. When the men gathered at the tavern and argued about strange shadows near the mill, I nodded politely and offered no opinion. When someone suggested the valley housed a creature, the preacher called such talk sinful, accusing anyone who believed of courting madness or spiritual corruption. Pride and superstition mix easily in small places, especially when a story challenges the order of things. I swallowed my words, knowing that knowledge becomes dangerous when handled by people more eager to shoot than understand. Yet the forest tugged at me like memory. I continued leaving food, water, and small tools, each offering shaped by the hope that familiarity would keep the mother safe. Once, after freezing rain, I found a heavy pile of pine boughs placed atop my usual drop site. Underneath, she had left a thick fur pelt, cleaned and meticulously arranged. The weight of it nearly buckled my knees. I pressed my palm against the fur and felt tears sting unexpectedly. That pelt was not payment. It was gratitude. Late one December evening, while gathering kindling beneath the glow of my lantern, I felt eyes on me again. I turned slowly and saw the silhouette of the Bigfoot mother, standing near the edge of the tree-line. Snow drifted across her shoulders like white lace. The child clung to her side, tiny fingers gripping her fur. Cheeks glowed with warmth from her body heat. She did not approach, but she did not run. We stood in silence, listening to the hush of snowfall, our breaths floating like two fragile lanterns in the dark. For the first time, I spoke aloud without fear. I told her she was safe near me, that no harm would come from my hands. I thanked her for trusting me, for raising the child with a gentleness that defied every cruel assumption people make about what is wild. She blinked slowly, her breath steaming, and then she disappeared into the darkness as if swallowed by the forest itself. The next week, the town council held a closed-door meeting. Word spread that a group of hunters wanted to track whatever left those footprints, convinced it threatened their livestock and reputations. The sheriff did not deny the request. I sat near the back, feeling dread like a stone lodged beneath my ribs. I knew that if they crossed a ravine with rifles and dogs, the forest would not remain a sanctuary. Fear had taken root, and fear rarely learns to see the truth. I walked home under a moonless sky, boots crunching over crusted snow. The wind tasted metallic, carrying the scent of distant storm clouds and burning firewood from neighboring cabins. For the first time since the bomb began, I felt the sharp panic of losing something that mattered more than my own safety. If those men ever found a mother and child, they would not pause long enough to consider tenderness or history or the quiet dignity of survival. They would see a target. That night, long after the lantern dimmed, I realized silence might not be enough to protect them. I felt a promise forming in the hollow of my chest, one that would demand more from me than discretion. I prayed the hunters would fail, but part of me sensed the forest would soon need more than secrecy to survive. Early spring of 1981 arrived with sunlight that felt reluctant, as if winter still clung to the spruce needles and river stones. The toddler's voice echoed through the ravine with laughter like a small bell, reminding me that life continued regardless of the unease gathering in town. I listened from a respectful distance, leaning against a moss-covered log, watching the child tug gently at the Bigfoot mother's fur, trying to balance on wobbling legs. Watching them felt like witnessing a rare truth hidden from a world unwilling to see tenderness in anything unfamiliar. I sensed that I had been allowed into something sacred, something older than our stories and older than our fear. The Bigfoot mother had matured as a protector since the first time I saw her cradle the infant. She watched the child with unwavering patience, guiding each step with soft nudges of her massive hand. She would lift him quickly whenever he stumbled near a sharp rock or slippery stone, her instincts as precise as any human guardian. My heart swelled each time the toddler steadied himself and reached toward the sunlight with a delighted squeal. His joy felt contagious, and for a few blessed minutes I could forget the rustle of rifles and rumors spreading beyond the tree-line. One evening, after a long day at the sawmill, I visited the ravine with a warm pot of stew wrapped in thick cloth. The mother approached me cautiously, examining every scent with narrowed eyes. She lifted the child so he could smell the stew, letting him decide before she took a slow spoonful. When she hummed softly, I felt a surge of humility that nearly brought me to my knees. The child's eyes widened with comfort, and he reached out, lightly touching my sleeve with tiny fingers as if offering thanks. Something inside me shifted permanently. I realized I had become part of their small, fragile family, whether I deserved it or not. The sickness arrived without warning. A cold snap had frozen the creek, and puddles near the ravine grew stagnant. One morning, I heard the child's cries and followed the sound into the clearing. His skin was flushed, his forehead burning, his breath shallow. The Bigfoot mother held him close, trembling with despair. She lowered her head toward me, desperate for help. I understood instantly that the fever could take him if we did nothing. I boiled willow bark and crushed herbs into soothing tea, cooling it with fresh snow before placing the cup into the mother's hand. She studied me with grief clouding her eyes, then lifted the cup gently to the child's lips. Sweat beaded across his cheeks, and each sigh struck me like a knife. I stayed through the night, lighting a small fire and wrapping the child in wool, checking his pulse, cooling his face with clean cloth. The mother hovered close, humming constantly, her hand resting over his heart as if she could keep it beating by will alone. I spoke softly to her, describing how children sometimes needed days to recover, how fever was not defeat, but a sign that the body fought fiercely. She blinked with something resembling hope, though her voice remained a low tremor that felt like a lament for every threat she could not control. The fever finally broke on the third night. The child slept peacefully, his skin returning to a healthy shade. The mother breathed with audible relief, shoulders relaxing beneath the weight she had silently carried. When dawn arrived, she placed her forehead against mine, letting her long breath warm my cheek like an unspoken blessing. The bond between us hardened into something unshakable, tied by fear, exhaustion, and a victory no one else would ever witness. Danger soon followed. 3 hunters returned from the ridge whispering about enormous tracks and nighttime roars. They had found broken traps, snapped cleanly in half as if twisted by great force. Suspicion grew like rot in the tavern. The sheriff met me on the boardwalk one evening, his voice low and warning. He accused me of interfering with official efforts, insisting I knew more than I claimed. I felt my pulse hammering as he reminded me that a man could lose more than reputation by protecting dangerous secrets. His eyes were not cruel, just weary, as if he feared disruption more than truth. I walked away with my hands shaking, a cold knot forming at the base of my spine. The hunters organized without waiting for approval. One icy morning, I followed them into the forest, praying they would never reach the ravine. The wind carried a metallic scent of gun oil, and their boots snapped branches like brittle bones. The Bigfoot mother sensed them long before I did. She stood between us and the shelter, her body rigid, eyes blazing. The toddler clung to her leg, terrified. The hunters raised their rifles. Before they could fire, I slammed my rifle upward and shot into the air. The blast cracked through the valley, sending birds scattering. The hunters cursed and stumbled back, startled. They threatened to report me to the sheriff, calling me unstable and foolish. I did not care. They left swearing revenge, convinced the forest concealed something monstrous. From that day on, the town treated me like a stranger. Doors closed quietly when I approached the general store. Children whispered behind mittened hands. I endured the humiliation because loyalty felt heavier than pride. The Bigfoot mother understood something had shifted. She watched the edges of the ravine more warily, listening for footsteps that did not belong. She continued caring for the child with steady resolve, but I could sense her fear sharpening like a blade. One night, after leaving food and blankets beneath the cedar roots, I sat motionless beneath the moon and realized that silence alone would no longer shield them. Too many eyes searched the hills, too many guns polished by idle anxiety. If hunters ever reached the ravine with conviction instead of curiosity, the outcome would shatter both mother and child. The burden settled on my shoulders with the weight of inevitability. I knew I would need to guide them somewhere safer, somewhere beyond the reach of desperate men. I breathed in the cold air, tasting iron and pine, and understood that sacrifice was no longer a possibility, but a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The winter of 1982 came earlier than anyone expected, thick with snow that clung to branches like cotton and muted every sound in the valley. By then, the child was 4 years old, lively and curious, strong enough to climb over small rocks and tumble through moss with laughter that brightened the darkest mornings. The Bigfoot mother remained as vigilant as ever, guiding him with endless patience, teaching him how to gather berries and drink safely from thawed pools near the ravine. I watched them often from a hidden ridge, marveling at how their bond resembled a language older than words, a constant exchange of touch, gesture, and protective instinct. It made me feel that the forest had chosen them, or perhaps chosen me to witness them. Rumors, however, did not rest. Hunters believed they heard something larger than a bear near the northern ridge. A state official visited the valley with maps, cameras, and questions that made my blood run cold. He walked the boardwalk with the sheriff, talking about unidentified wildlife movement and ecosystem threat. I could tell from the official's crisp jacket and restless eyes that he cared little for restraint. The hunters, emboldened by outside attention, cleaned their rifles beneath the tavern's porch, spitting tobacco into the snow and boasting about what they would do if they caught sight of anything unusual. The air tasted harsher that winter, as though the cold carried anxiety deeper into the forest. I knew then that the mother and child could not stay near the ravine. The frost felt sharper, and worry gnawed at me like a dull blade. One night, I led them along a remote trail that climbed toward abandoned homestead land, where no traps were set and no men wandered during winter storms. The moon barely peeked through clouds, and the forest smelled of frozen earth and distant rain. I left caches of food wrapped in cloth and pointed toward a series of caves sheltered by dense firs, hoping they would remain unseen. The mother understood my urgency, though she did not relax until we reached the first ridge. Her eyes kept searching the forest as if danger had already arrived. Days later, the snowfall grew relentless, burying old tracks and making the woods feel strangely empty. I stayed close to the ridge whenever possible, checking for signs of distress or hunger. On most mornings, I found only faint impressions of footsteps, wide and deep, trailing toward the caves. I told myself that safety had settled at last. But fear does not disappear simply because we want it to. Every sound felt amplified. The crack of ice underfoot, the bark of distant rifles, the roar of wind funneling between trees. Then, one late afternoon, a storm rolled in with terrifying speed. Snow swirled to the air like torn feathers, and visibility vanished within minutes. I could barely stand upright as the wind shoved against my chest, pulling at my coat like an angry hand. An instinct deeper than logic sent me toward the caves. My breath burned with cold, and every step felt heavier as if the storm itself were trying to stop me from reaching them. The child's cry reached me faintly through the wind, desperate and thin. I followed the sound toward a hollow framed by boulders and tangled spruce roots. The Bigfoot mother lay collapsed on her side, fur drenched with blood near her shoulder. Whether she had been grazed by a bullet or injured during a fall, I could not tell immediately. The child sat beside her, wailing, pressing his small hands against her chest. The snow around them glowed as if illuminated by tragedy. I removed my coat and wrapped the child inside it, pressing him to my body to keep him warm. His tiny fingers dug into my arms, his eyes frantic with fear. The mother's breath was slow, each inhale labored, each exhale sounding like surrender. I knelt beside her and tried to stop the bleeding with resin-soaked cloth, though the wound continued oozing beneath my shaking hands. She lifted her head, eyes meeting mine with a depth that hollowed out my ribs. I whispered that she was not alone, that the child would live, that storms could not claim what love had already protected. Snowflakes melted across her eyelashes, as if winter itself mourned her exhaustion. She nudged the child weakly toward me, urging him into my arms with strength that defied her fading pulse. I could not breathe for a moment, my throat thick with grief. I begged her to hold on, promising that morning would offer warmth and healing. She pressed her hand against my shoulder as if thanking me for trying, then rested her face against the child's forehead, inhaling one last memory. Her final breath escaped slowly, drifting to the cold air like a farewell too sacred for language. When silence settled, I felt as though the forest itself paused to honor her. The child pressed his hand against her cheek, sobbing until his voice gave out. I held them both, letting grief settle over us like a blanket. I spoke softly into darkness, promising the child that he would survive, that love would not end here. If winter is the season of endings, it is also the season of stubborn resilience. The child's life was proof of that. I carried him through the storm, shielding him with every ounce of warmth my body could offer. The snow grew heavier, erasing our tracks as quickly as we made them. I reached a hidden passage that led deeper into old-growth forest untouched by hunters or surveyors. There at dawn, beneath a silver sky and a hush of fresh snowfall, I found a familiar quiet. footprints belonging to other Bigfoot, wide and steady, leading into a distant valley where men rarely traveled. I placed the child gently on the trail, whispering my final promise, that he was home now, that he would be protected by those like him and those unlike him, that memory would carry the mother's love where human voices could not. When I returned to town, no one asked where I had been. The sheriff closed every report and told the hunters the valley was clear. The official left with nothing more than frozen photographs of empty snowbanks. Silence wrapped the town like a burial shroud, protecting reputation instead of truth. I never contested their certainty. I simply lived with the knowledge that the forest held its own evidence. Each winter since, when the first snow falls, I find a single enormous footprint near my cabin door, gentle, unmistakable, waiting like a greeting. I touch its edges and feel gratitude that transcends language. I understand now that secrets carried from love do not burden the soul. They keep the soul alive long after youth disappears. And tonight, as the firelight flickers across the room, I no longer wonder whether anyone will believe me. I only hope that when I take my final breath, someone else will feel the quiet footsteps in the snow and understand that the forest remembers everything we tried to forget. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.